I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's February 20th, and we have a lot to talk about. And before we get into today's episode, I'd like to talk about something that's, a little bit different. Yesterday was the 4th anniversary of my wife Jean's passing. At the time Jean passed away from complications due to advanced progressive MS, I very briefly shared that news on that week's podcast episode and said that I'd have more to share about Jean's story at another time. Well, here we are, 4 years and just over 200 podcast episodes later, and it feels like maybe we've arrived at the right time. I met Jean almost 10 years before her diagnosis. Her early morning routine was established well before I came into her life. She'd wake up every day at 4 a.m. to go on a 40-mile bike ride with her cycling partner. Besides cycling, Jean loved hiking in the nearby Santa Monica Mountains. I met Jean 3 years before Hollywood discovered how talented she was, and she became a highly in-demand screenwriter. Jean excelled at creating characters that were so real you'd swear you knew them. And she'd put her characters into the most outrageously funny, but completely human and therefore dark comic situations. She had a sharp wit and a smile that could drop you from 100 yards away. Jean was originally from New Jersey, and we met at a writers' group that was sponsored by the American Film Institute. Ironically, I was the first in our group to have sold a screenplay, and one evening after our writers' group meeting, Jean and several other members of the group decided to go out for a beer. I passed, but halfway home had a change of heart, turned around, and headed for the bar that was our group's unofficial headquarters. I walked in just as I heard Jean ask if anyone had any idea how much I had sold my screenplay for. Jean's back was to the door, and she hadn't seen me come in, although everyone else at the table did. I was standing right behind her, and I said, "Well, why don't you just ask me?" Now, this is a G-rated podcast, so I won't share what her exact reply was. Apparently, she was a little embarrassed being caught wondering aloud about how much money I had made. Well, one thing led to another, and a couple of weeks later, we went on a date that lasted for about a week. From that point on, we became fairly inseparable. 2 years later, Jean sold her first screenplay, and we were married a year after that in 1990. Before we go any further, I want to make sure you understand that Jean's MS journey was not the journey most people living with MS will ever face. While some of you may relate to what I'm sharing, please don't make the mistake of thinking that Jean's story is your story. Jean was diagnosed with secondary progressive MS in 1997, and you might be wondering about her relapsing remitting phase. Well, Jean's MRI showed that her lesions were quite old, but fortunately she lived a life so free of symptoms she never knew she had been living with MS. Now, of course, after her diagnosis, when you go back and review everything that's ever happened to you to try to determine when you actually had the earliest signs of MS, she realized that she had suffered through 2 days of optic neuritis during her freshman year of college, which meant she had been living virtually symptom-free for almost 20 years. As benign as her early signs and symptoms of MS may have been, the symptoms that developed at the time of her diagnosis were particularly vicious, and from that moment on, her disease progression seemed relentless. It was as though Jean's MS had decided to make up for lost time. Her very first symptom was a severe tremor that started in her right hand, then spread to her head and her left hand. That one symptom alone made it impossible for Jean to brush her hair, brush her teeth, get dressed, use a mouse, keyboard, phone, or remote, or even feed herself. And so that one debilitating MS symptom meant that Jean could no longer do her job or even care for herself. But Jean wasn't facing one debilitating MS symptom. Instead, there were a bunch. Within just a few short years, Jean transitioned from that successful screenwriter who got up at 4 a.m. every morning to go cycling to a bedbound quadriplegic with vision issues, cognitive decline, mood, and speech issues. Within 6 years, Jean was receiving all of her nutrition by means of a feeding tube. Within 10 years, she required assistance breathing. I stopped working to serve as Jean's caregiver for just over 10 years, and for those last couple of years, it was me along with a live-in nurse in our home, which, with all of the medical equipment we had accumulated, had come to more closely resemble a clinic. Even with a live-in nurse, Jean eventually reached a point where she could no longer be safely cared for at home. Over the final 10 years of her life, Jean went from a skilled nursing facility to a subacute nursing facility to a long-term acute care hospital, and no matter where she happened to be, I visited her every day and took on the role of her medical advocate. Jean lost her ability to speak for the final 6 years of her life, so we went from having very typical conversations to me phrasing everything as a yes-no question. Unable to nod or shake her head, Jean would blink once for yes and twice for no. And in the final months of her life, she even lost the ability to blink back those replies. As heartbreaking as it was to watch the person I loved slowly disappear, I kept reminding myself that I wasn't the one with MS. So my job was to walk into whatever room she was in with a smile and to remember to leave with one, even as I sometimes felt the tears already forming. If you don't happen to think that MS affects families and not just individuals, I'm ready to have that debate with you. I don't think that MS realized what sort of a fight it was in for when it picked on a hot-blooded Italian girl from Jersey. And while Jean spent 23 years battling back with everything she had, it wasn't quite enough. As I've said before, progressive MS takes no prisoners. Even with great PPO health insurance, the out-of-pocket costs for Jean's care were staggering, and over the course of her illness, we lost everything, except the belief that no family should have to go through what we were going through. When I was given an opportunity to become a member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, representing the perspective of families affected by progressive MS, I explained to Jean that it would require traveling to the committee's meetings, and that would prevent me from visiting her on the days that I'd be gone. She thought the alliance represented hope that someone else wouldn't ever find themselves in her situation, and she told me I had to go. When I thought about starting this podcast, Jean had no idea what a podcast was. But when she listened to episode number 1 of Real Talk MS, she locked eyes with me and smiled. And so here we are today, using the hardest and most painful experience in my life to fuel whatever actions I can take to help create a more hopeful future for people affected by MS. It's the small upside I've created to offset all that Jean and I went through. I've always tried to be 100% transparent in everything I share with you. Thanks for letting me share Jean's story. If you're a regular listener, you've probably heard me say more than once that the things that people affected by MS want the most, things like access to quality health care, affordable prescription medications, and funding for MS research are, to a large extent, all functions of public policy. The people who decide whether we get those things are our elected officials at both the state and federal level. That's why advocacy has always been a personal priority for me. The National MS Society's Public Policy Conference gets underway in just a couple of weeks on March 4th. And joining me today to talk about the importance of this year's conference is the National MS Society's Vice President of Advocacy and a good friend of the podcast, Steffany Stern. But before we get to my conversation with Steffany, there are a few other things that you should know about. In 2015, a group of international MS experts published a paper offering an overview of the state of research in progressive forms of multiple sclerosis. The paper looked at recent progress, called out issues that still needed to be resolved, and identified potential pathways forward to improve clinical trials, allowing for faster development of new treatments for progressive MS. Now that group of experts has published a new paper that serves as a sort of update, exploring changes in the MS research landscape since 2015 and identifying emerging concepts relevant to treating and researching progressive MS. In their newly published paper, the team of collaborators points out that if progressive MS is found to be active, with signs of inflammation such as new MRI activity or relapses, it may be responsive to currently available disease-modifying therapies. They call out the fact that disease worsening can occur in the absence of relapses. Now, this phenomenon is known as progression independent of relapse activity, or PIRA. And recognizing this helps focus questions around how to treat it. I'll also mention that if you'd like to better understand what progression independent of relapse activity is all about, you'll want to catch next week's episode of Real Talk MS. The paper includes an important observation. The scientists write that biological mechanisms driving progressive MS may include inflammation compartmentalized within the brain and spinal cord, abnormal metabolic processes and stress, and inadequate compensatory mechanisms such as remyelination, and each of these processes may require a different treatment approach. Now, this list of biological mechanisms begins to answer one of the most important questions in MS research: what causes progression? What's equally important here is the call for different treatments that target specific biological mechanisms, which suggests a future where MS medications will be less of the one-size-fits-all variety. Instead, an individual will likely take more than one medication that targets the specific biological mechanisms driving that individual's disease progression. And another individual may be taking different medications designed to resolve the mechanisms driving their disease progression. This precision medicine approach to treating MS will be an enormous step forward in how MS is treated in the clinic. And the paper calls for a new framework for describing phases of MS based on the underlying biology rather than just the clinical manifestations of MS. If you're a regular listener, you'll recognize this as a theme we've been talking about for the past year. As scientists continue to learn more about MS, there's a growing realization that we can adopt better, more specific ways of describing MS than the somewhat generic descriptions that have been in use for almost 30 years. If you'd like to review what will continue to be a key topic when it comes to MS research and treatment, you can check out Real Talk MS episode number 280, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. The paper also includes an overview of recently completed clinical trials in progressive MS and also details the 12 ongoing Phase 3 clinical trials that are expected to be completed in the next several years. As a reminder, results of a Phase 3 clinical trial are required to gain approval from drug regulatory agencies like the Federal Drug Administration or the European Medicines Agency. Among the ongoing Phase 3 clinical trials is the MS STAT2 trial, which is testing whether the cholesterol-lowering drug simvastatin can slow progression among people with secondary progressive MS. This trial is scheduled to be completed this year. There are currently 3 different Phase 3 clinical trials looking at a new category of disease-modifying therapies called Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or BTK inhibitors. We've talked about these trials over the past couple of years on this podcast, and we'll continue updating you as news develops. There's a very unique multi-arm, multi-stage clinical trial called Octopus that's designed to test several therapies for efficacy among people with primary or secondary progressive MS. Currently, Octopus is testing a diabetes drug called metformin, and an antioxidant called alpha lipoic acid to determine whether either can slow the rate of brain atrophy and disease progression. This trial is expected to be completed in 2028. We've been following octopus since the study was first announced almost 3 years ago. If you'd like to learn more about what makes octopus such a unique clinical trial, you can check out Real Talk MS episode number 193, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. The BEAT MS clinical trial is comparing the efficacy of autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation with currently available high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies. This study is expected to be completed by 2029. The authors of the paper call for changes that will speed the testing of experimental therapies and make clinical trials more informative about how a therapy will work in the real world. They call for improving the design of clinical trials, including involving people living with MS while a trial is being designed, to ensure that a proposed study is both feasible and relevant to people living with progressive MS. The authors call for greater diversity among participants who are recruited for clinical trials to better reflect the races, ethnicities, and ages of people affected by MS who may one day consider starting a new therapy once it's been approved. The authors conclude by painting an optimistic picture of better treatments for progressive MS that are already on the horizon as they write, and I'm quoting now, "Further success is expected as novel immunomodulatory mechanisms, particularly those targeting elements within the central nervous system, complete trials over the next 2 years." End quote. What it means is that we know more, and by continuing to build upon what we're learning, better treatments for progressive MS that will be available faster are already on the way. And as someone whose wife was profoundly impacted by progressive MS, short of a cure, I can't imagine getting better news. This is an important paper that provides not only an overview of where the science is today, but offers a detailed glimpse into where it's heading over the next few years. I wish that I could provide you with a link to the paper, but it's behind a paywall, and the best that's available to the public is the published summary of the paper, and you'll find a link to that summary in today's show notes. In just 2 days, on Thursday, February 22nd, the International Progressive MS Alliance is hosting a global webcast titled New Treatments for Progressive MS, Recent Advances and Promising Research. During this webcast, a panel of experts will discuss the current state of treatments for progressive MS, active clinical trials that may provide new solutions, and research efforts to develop breakthrough treatments designed to end MS progression. The webcast takes place this Thursday, February 22nd at 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Central European Time, and you'll find the link to register for the webcast in today's show notes. While we're focusing on emerging treatments, I think it's important to remember that gaining access to those treatments and making those treatments financially feasible for someone living with a chronic illness, those kinds of decisions are made by our state and federal legislators. In just a couple of weeks, close to 200 MS activists will be on Capitol Hill to talk with our congressional representatives about the issues that matter most to the MS community. In a moment, the National MS Society's Vice President of Advocacy, Steffany Stern, joins me to give us a preview of what to expect at this year's Public Policy Conference. We're 2 weeks away from the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference, which takes place in Washington, D.C. And as an MS activist, this is something I look forward to every year. Joining me to talk about what we can expect at this year's Public Policy Conference is the MS Society's Vice President for Advocacy, Steffany Stern. Welcome back to the podcast, Steffany.
So glad to be here on the podcast and glad to be with you, John.
Well, thanks. And before we get into the specifics of this year's Public Policy Conference, I'm hoping you'll share some thoughts on why advocacy is so important for people affected by MS.
I am so passionate about advocacy and empowering people affected by MS to join in. I think there's nothing more effective and more powerful than people affected by MS coming together to raise awareness about what is multiple sclerosis and educate their elected officials on what are the needs of people affected by MS to drive policy change. And I'm so proud to be a part of that movement. One of my favorite things about my job is how it feels to be in the room with people affected by MS as they meet with their elected officials, telling their stories and, making a really strategic ask for what they need. And I just love seeing how that translates into policy change.
For the benefit of any of my listeners who've started listening to the podcast since last year's public policy conference, can you tell us a little bit about what the public policy conference is?
Yes, I would love to. First of all, I want everybody to know the National MS Society's 2024 Public Policy Conference will be held on March 4th to the 6th in Washington, D.C. So something to be aware of when we'll be gathering. We will be bringing MS activists together to learn, to hear speeches from elected officials who care deeply about our mission. They will be getting trained up on our policy issues that we'll be bringing to Capitol Hill on our Hill Day. They'll be able to connect with one another, and then they'll be headed to Capitol Hill to meet with their members of Congress and advocate for the two issues that we have chosen as our focus issues for this year's public policy conference. This year, we have about 170 MS activists and staff who will be attending. They will be focusing on really targeted meetings this year. We're targeting key members of Congress who are on certain committees that are relevant to our MS policy priorities, and as well as members of the leadership from the House and the Senate.
So my listeners can better understand, for a bill to get voted on by either House of Congress, it has to get through committee first. That's where all the serious activity takes place. The committees are the ones that decide which bills go to the floor for votes. So it's really, really important. Steffany, 2024 is an important presidential election year. Does this add anything more or different to this year's public policy conference?
It is a really interesting year in Congress. We are very aware that the fact that it's a huge election year will have an impact on the calendar that Congress is facing and the timeline for when they advance policy. So we know that Congress will be the most active on policy solutions and advancing bills through committee and through the chambers in the first part of this year through March or April, maybe into May. And then pretty soon after that, they go out on the campaign trail. They kind of break. They take a lot more, call them recesses. They go back to their districts and meet with constituents. And, the presidential campaign will be very much in the background of that. There'll be so much focus this year on the election. So that means that there's urgency for us to advance our policy agenda sooner rather than later, before they recess and go out and campaign. There's a couple of deadlines that Congress has to meet. There's some funding bills, spending bills that run out on March 1st and March 8th. So we are going to be advocating for them to, continue funding the government and not shut down the government after that. They have to get their work done before they head out. We would love for them to address several key health policy priorities that we have been tracking, including pharmacy benefit manager reform, which we're really hearing good things about the possibility for pharmacy benefit manager reform to sort of ride along with the spending bill. Our fingers are crossed on that one. Stay tuned. We'll be reaching out and asking people to send an action alert on that to make sure that Congress knows how important that is. But yes, I would say the election kind of splits the year into two parts, the before and the after. So we'll be really working hard this first part of the year to get as much done as possible. And then after the election, our focus will turn to the lame duck session and getting everything we can possibly get done before the end of the year and before the new Congress resets.
Each year, activists at the Public Policy Conference and at home focus on 2 or 3 specific issues that affect people living with MS. What are the issues at the federal level that MS activists will be focusing on at this year's PPC?
Yes, we have 2 great issues this year. Both are very important to people affected by MS. People across the MS community have told us that these are issues that are so important to them. And there's some urgency along with both of them. So our first issue will be advocating for Congress to fund the MS research program at the Department of Defense. As you know, this is the sole federal funding stream dedicated to MS research. And if you've been following along at all, you know that the congressional appropriation cycle this year has been mayhem. And there is less consensus than we have really ever seen before on how the Congress will make decisions about federal funding. So we will be headed to the Hill and asking for them to fund the MS research program, to make that a priority, continue and maintain that funding. And our second policy issue that we will be focusing on for the public policy conference is telehealth. We're going to be asking Congress to extend the access to telehealth that was established during the pandemic. There are a lot of flexibilities and options that people gained during the pandemic, and they are set to expire in December at the end of this year. People living with MS have really benefited from these telehealth options for a very wide range of healthcare services, and we want to maintain that as an option to improve, access to really comprehensive and quality care for people living with MS.
2 really important issues. But I think one of the true silver linings of the pandemic was seeing how effective telehealth could be. So this is such a great issue to get behind.
It absolutely is. And we're finding it so important for people from a range of backgrounds, for people living in rural areas, as well as people living in urban areas who have transportation barriers. We know a lot of people living with MS face symptoms, including serious fatigue or mobility challenges. We hear from people living with MS, they've been able to take advantage of telehealth options, and it has improved the quality of their care and their access to care.
MS activists are involved in advocacy work on both the federal and state level. Can you talk about the kinds of activities that take place at the state level?
Yes. The state work is so important. And as you know, a lot of times Congress doesn't act until the states have acted and demonstrated that policies are possible and that there's support at the state level. At the state level, we have a variety of ways people can get involved with advocacy, from attending an event at their capital. If we have one of those events in their states, we call them state action days, where we bring people affected by MS to meet in person with legislators. We have a range of formats for those events this year. We're hosting some of those events in people's home districts because it's often challenging for them to get to the Capitol on that, only one day a year. We're offering some virtual options for people who again, might struggle to get off work or to travel. We are doing everything we can to connect people to their elected officials to talk about what's important to people with MS. And at the state level, we have a robust policy agenda similar to what we talk about in Congress, access to high quality and affordable healthcare for people with MS, access to MS medications, addressing people with MS, addressing their economic security, disability rights, and very long list of other issues that have been identified by people with MS as priorities.
It's been my experience that advocating on behalf of your own interests is one of the most empowering things that someone can do. I always encourage all of my listeners to get involved in advocacy. So how can someone sign up to be an MS activist? And once they do, what happens next?
I love answering that question. I love pointing out that even if you can't attend our in-person conference in Washington, D.C., or you can't make it to your state level event, everyone can take part from home. You can join in from home. You can do that action alert that corresponds to the same issues that we're talking about on Hill Day at Public Policy Conference. You can get an alert that goes right to your inbox, and you can take action, send it to your members of Congress, and issue a call to action. You can still tell your story. You can personalize that message and talk about what this issue means for your life. And you can join in all of the wonderful advocacy campaign issues that we have going at the state and federal level. You just sign up at www.nationalmssociety.org/MSactivist. You can use the hashtag MSActivist to share alerts when you do them. We encourage you to follow at MSActivists on, like, it used to be Twitter. Now we're calling it X. You can follow us there for updates. Again, we issue calls to action there. If you're really a social media person, we are going to be taking over the Society's Instagram account on March 6th on our Hill Day. A total takeover to give a glimpse of what is happening on the Hill. So we need everyone's voices to join in this movement. Like I said, only 170 people will be attending the Public Policy Conference in person, but we would benefit from a chorus of voices, thousands of messages being sent to Capitol Hill on the same day from around the country. So we hope people will join in.
Well, Steffany Stern, the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference is certainly a key advocacy event, but it's just one moment in time. I want to thank you and the entire advocacy team for everything you guys do throughout the year to help ensure that the issues that are important to people affected by MS stay top of mind with our elected officials. I want to thank you so much for talking with me today, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Looking forward to it. See you in DC, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/338. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.